Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. It's very rare that I have not a repeat guest, but a three-peat guest. And today I've got Dr. Matt Ridley with me for the third time, although it should have been the fourth time, and we'll talk about it in a second. Welcome, Matt. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be with you, and the things you're achieving are remarkable.
Oh, you're too kind. So let me mention the latest book, which just came out 2 days ago, I think. I'm very excited to hear about it because it's also one of my sort of scientific areas, applying evolution in my case to human behavior. You're applying it to an avian species. So this is Birds, Sex, and Beauty: The Extraordinary Implications of Charles Darwin's Strangest Idea, which is sexual selection. For those of you who don't know who Matt is, he's an unbelievably prolific author. Many books, I'll only mention a few: The Red Queen, Genome, The Rational Optimist, The Evolution of Everything, How Innovation Works. And the previous book to this one, which I'd like us to start with, and I'll explain why I'm trying to correct a wrong, a book with Elena Chan titled Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, which was one of the original references that basically argued for the lab leak theory. Matt's people had reached out to me, so this would probably be 2021, I think. So in the height of the COVID hysteria and censorship and so on, and they said, "Hey, Matt would love to come on your show to discuss viral. Would you like to host them?" And of course, as you all know, that I don't shy away from speaking about any issue, but then I had to be a non-reckless martyr and say, look, I'm happy to host Matt, but here's what's going to happen if I host him. The clip is going to be removed by YouTube within 15 seconds because the settled science says that Matt is not allowed to say this. And then maybe my YouTube channel would be shut down. So what is the point of us going through the exercise? It's going to be erased. So I want to correct this. Let's begin with viral. Tell us what that book was about, how your views have evolved to be even stronger towards the lab leak theory, and then we'll get into the sexual selection book. Take it away, Matt.
Yes, because the crazy thing, Gad, is that had you had me on the show in 2021, I would have said, we don't know how this pandemic began. It could have been a natural event or it could have been a lab leak. That was the view of Alina Chan and me when we set out to write this book. The book is called The Search for the Origin. It's not called The Origin. It's called, how are we going to find out how this thing started? And our book devotes equal amounts of time to the theory that it jumped naturally into the human species in a market, as to the theory that it might have been the result of a laboratory accident in Wuhan. But since then, and just before the book came out, there was a very important revelation of a document called the Diffuse Proposal, which I'll explain in a minute, which left us more and more strongly convinced that the lab leak was not just possible but probable. And the evidence has only got stronger since. The evidence for the market has got weaker. The Chinese authorities would love it to be the market. They initially said it was the market. They now say it wasn't. They say it got their own frozen lobsters from Maine or something, which makes no sense at all to anybody. Just to sort of put it in perspective here, there are 40,000 markets selling live animals in China, roughly. There is one lab working on SARS-like beta coronaviruses from bats. It's in Wuhan. The market in Wuhan is not particularly active in the selling of mammals. They found no infected animal in the market. You cannot sort of stress that strongly enough. They searched and searched, and there was no infected animal in the market. They found weasels running around, and cats and dogs, and raccoon dogs on sale, and yet none of them were infected. So, and in the case of SARS or MERS or Nipah or any of these other natural zoonoses, you find an infected animal, you find a chain of human infections, you find all this very strong evidence as to what's happened. And in this case, what we end up with is that there is a lab in Wuhan working on exactly the right kind of virus. I mean, so exactly that they switched attention the year before the pandemic from SARS like viruses to 20% different genetically SARS like viruses, which this one is. And they were working on, they had a plan to put a thing called a furin cleavage site into a SARS like virus for the very first time ever. And this virus is the only one out of about 800 that we've looked at, SARS like viruses, that has a furin cleavage site in it. So they were planning exactly the right experiment in exactly the right place at exactly the right time at exactly the wrong biosafety level. So it's and they behaved in the most ridiculously suspicious way after the outbreak happened. So it is absurd for anyone to pretend that this is not a viable hypothesis that needs to be properly investigated. And remember, the purpose of these experiments they were doing was to predict and prevent the next pandemic.
So
So
these,
it wasn't just research that went wrong, it was pandemic prevention research that went wrong. And that means you really do have to re examine your assumptions about why this kind of work is happening.
amazing. So I just finished with, so I'm a visiting professor this year in Michigan, and I was actually teaching a remote class from my home in Montreal. And the first assignment was for the students to identify an academic paper that would fall under the rubric, the unscientific rubric of forbidden knowledge, things that you shouldn't study. And one of the students to the point that we're talking about here, discussed the COVID lab leak theory as forbidden knowledge, of which I mentioned, oh, I'll be speaking to the author of the book that proposed that in a few days, which would be today. Now, he asked me, he said, well, why do you think it was forbidden knowledge, Professor? And so I proposed two possibilities, which I'd like to posit here, and then you tell me if you think I'm on the right track or maybe there are additional reasons. So I thought, well, number one, it wouldn't look good if, you know, Americans or the world in general found out that some American taxpayer money was going to fund this thing. So that we got to shut that down. It's certainly a lot more palpable to most people that it was just a naturally occurring thing. So that's number one. Number two, if I now put on my super politically correct woke hat on, well, I don't want to say that it originated in China because then that might marginalize Asian Americans and there'd be increased attacks on them, or some variant of that sort of story. Do do you think that those two factors captured the reticence to actually support the lab leak theory, or is there anything else that's going on?
Yeah, well, I think just as background to my answer to that, it's worth noting that the vast majority of the public now thinks a lab leak is quite likely. People come up to me all the time and say, you must feel vindicated. They say the same to my brilliant co-author, Alina Chan. Um, but the scientific establishment hasn't budged an inch. Nature magazine, Science magazine, all these ones. Alina and I and Professor Anton van der Merwe of Oxford University have prepared, I think it's now five formal scientific papers assessing the evidence objectively with hundreds of references to our sources and submitted them to journals. And we used to get the rejection, this is a conspiracy theory, it's not acceptable to publish it. We now get the response, oh, everyone knows this stuff, it's no longer fresh enough to publish.
Can I interrupt you before you go on? Forgive me, Matt, because it's burning. Do you know, and I think if anybody would know, it'd be you. Of course, you know who JBS Haldane is, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember the quote by JBS Haldane, which I actually include in the epigraph to my final chapter in The Consuming Instinct, which is the red book right here, where I don't have the quote in front of me, but it literally says what you just said. Scientists go through four stages of acceptance before they accept the theory. Stage one, this is bullshit, this is nonsense. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. Stage
Yeah.
two, this is probably true, but a perverse point of view. Stage three, well, this is largely true, but who cares? It's unimportant. And stage four, I always said so. So that's literally what you just told me.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to look that quote up again. Yeah.
So,
But
so
anyway, to answer your question, why the reluctance of science and nature and the Royal Society and the National Academy to even debate this? I mean, I tried to get the Royal Society and the British Academy of Medical Sciences to debate the topic. And I said, you don't have to ask me, just invite two people to debate it. And they refuse. They say it's too controversial a subject. Well, of course it is. That's the whole point, you know. Anyway, so they won't do that. And why is this? There are, I think, the reasons you give are roughly right. One very senior British scientist said to me, um, I've always said that a lab leak is likely. I think this one was, but I really hope we never find out. And I said, what do you mean? Well, surely if an airplane crashed, you would never say that. And he said, well, it's very important that we don't annoy the Chinese because relations are bad enough anyway. And so there's a real kowtow going on here. I'm not sure one's allowed to use that phrase, but you know what I mean. That there is a degree of reluctance to confront the Chinese government on this issue because the Chinese government underpins the finances of a lot of scientific journals and a lot of universities, among other things. And because there is a real feeling that they might somehow take revenge. And allied to that, and you mentioned this, you know, well, isn't it rather racist to accuse the Chinese of starting this pandemic? Well, hang on, it was a lot more racist to go around saying it's their disgusting habits of eating live animals and bats and things like that started it, isn't it? You know, I mean, that seems to me even worse. So there's the element of not wanting to upset China, but then there's the other element of not wanting to tarnish the reputation of science and of virology in particular. Now, it seems to me that science had a dilemma here. At the very beginning, it could have said, and in private they did say this, it looks like a lab leak, we'd better look into it. And that way, the damage to the reputation of science would have remained confined to one area of virology, one very small part of virology, the part where you swap the spike genes between bat coronaviruses that don't infect human beings, you know, which is a kind of unbelievably stupid thing to have been doing anyway. Instead of which they said, no, no, this would be bad for the whole of science. Well, now it is. The reputation of science has been severely damaged by this pandemic. I think you and I will agree on that, partly because of all the lies told about the ability of the vaccine to stop transmission, whether the virus was airborne, and all these other things. You know, the overconfidence of some of the messaging, but also because of this, the biggest scandal of the lot. You know, the greatest industrial accident in the history of mankind, if that's what it was. It killed 1,000 times as many people as the Bhopal disaster in 1984. If that is the case, then the you know, and science refuses to examine whether it might have caused it. That is shocking. The World Health Organization, before the pandemic, had frequently said that a lab-related accident is now a strong possibility for the next pandemic and may even be a greater possibility than a natural event. They've stopped saying that since the pandemic. They don't like to go there.
amazing.
Now, you know, that is not honest. And you know, I'm a fan of science. I'm a scientist. I've been a champion of science all my life. And to have these leading scientists deliberately deceive the public, publish papers that said the opposite of what they thought in private, and refuse to engage with the search for an industrial accident that killed north of 20 million people is, to me, just utterly shocking.
So two quick points, and then I really want to move to your latest book that came out 2 days ago. Uh, Number one, when the scientists told you, well, you know, we don't want to speak the truth, and then they offer a consequentialist reason, that speaks to the tension between what I continuously talk about the tension between deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. And I argue, certainly in The Parasitic Mind and in my forthcoming book, in Suicidal Empathy, that there are certain principles that by definition have to be deontological. Freedom of speech is deontological. Freedom of inquiry is deontological. Presumption of innocence in the judicial system has to be deontological. If you say, I believe in freedom of speech, but, and then you give consequentialist answers, you violated it. So what these scientists are doing is they're doing the arguably the biggest epistemological no-no, which is they are contextualizing truth using a consequentialist calculus. That's devastating. So, number one. Number two, it does not surprise me, Matt, that the scientists refuse to alter their positions. This was about a year ago. I was invited on a British show, actually, by a British psychiatrist on his show. And at the end of the show, he asked me a question that surprisingly no one had ever asked me on any previous show I had been on. He asked, of all the phenomena that you've studied or know about in terms of human behavior, Professor, which is the one that has shocked you the most? And then I was taken aback. I have to think for a minute. And I said, well, I guess since you're putting me on the spot, probably the inability of people to change their opinions once it is anchored. And so all you're doing in saying what you said, Matt, is exactly that, which is la la la. It doesn't matter how much evidence Matt and Alina show me. I am not changing my position. That's a perfect manifestation of what a non-scientist should be doing.
I think that's exactly right. And there's a very interesting little subplot to this whole story, which is the story of how a paper called Proximal Origin of COVID-19 came to be published in Nature Medicine. It was commissioned effectively by Jeremy Farrar and Anthony Fauci of the Wellcome Trust and NIAID in early February 2020. A group of virologists, five of them, then went away to write it. The proposal was initially that they should say, well, it's maybe a lab leak, but it looks unlikely. These five all thought it was quite likely at the time. And they ended up publishing a paper that ruled it out, that said it was implausible, and that deceived me, among other people. I mean, I read that paper and thought, okay, fine, they've ruled it out. And I then realized that A, its arguments didn't stack up. But then we found the messages they sent each other during the preparation of that paper. It came out through a congressional subpoenas. And even after the paper was published, they were saying, I still think it's pretty likely it did come from a lab, while they were telling us, the plebs, that it didn't. And I just think the arrogance of that is so shocking. So and their argument, by the way, is, oh, we were being good scientists. We changed our mind when we saw new evidence. But they didn't change their mind. That's the whole point. They still thought it was a lab leak in private. They just wrote a paper saying that the very opposite.
Well,
It's truly extraordinary.
in a small, well, maybe not small manifestation of cosmic justice, one of the professors who was most hounded and censored during the COVID era, Jay Bhattacharya,
Yes.
is now confirmed as the NIH director. So maybe there is a epistemological God up there looking down on us.
Well, I think, yes, Jay Bhattacharya, Marty Makary at the FDA, John Ratcliffe at the CIA, these are all people who had, before their appointments, come out strongly in favor of the lab leak. And Jay and I we actually wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, which never got published, on some of the parallels between his persecution and my persecution, as it were. And I think his story is extraordinary, and the persecution of him was very, very unpleasant indeed,
Yeah.
and it was orchestrated by Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, who says, "What are we going to do to take down this guy and his theory?" And he now has Francis Collins' job. I mean, there's a little bit of sweetness there in
There's
the
got
world.
to be a Hollywood movie there coming up soon. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Okay,
Absolutely.
let's jump into all things avian. By the way, I love that you wrote this book because I often tell my wife that, I mean, birds are sort of like the rock stars, right, of the animal world. I mean, all the stuff. I mean, they are rock stars. They're unbelievable. So tell us
Yes.
Tell us
I,
why
I
you
wish I
decided.
was a bird.
Tell us why you wrote the book. I mean, much has been written about sexual selection and the handicap principle and Zahavian signaling. We'll get into all that. What made you say, you know what, I've got a story to tell that is unique and different from all the other stories that have been told here?
Well, first of all, it's actually what I did research on myself when I was a scientist a very long time ago. So it was very much back to my roots and back to the subject I know very well and that I'd seen develop over the years. Secondly, I'm a keen amateur naturalist. I love bird watching. And I thought if I write a book about bird watching, then I can go bird watching and call it research. And so I did. I traveled around the world. I went to Arctic Norway. I went to Papua New Guinea. I went to Australia to see particular species of birds doing their sexual displays. But for me, the interesting topic is the question of uh, beauty in the animal kingdom. Darwin wrestled with this question for several years, and he was both troubled by it and fascinated by it, and uh, it kind of dropped out of view. You know, we tend to think of arguments about evolution as being, you know, rather dry arguments about survival, but actually, you know, the peacock's tail, the extravagant displays of birds of paradise, the songs of nightingales, these things are not utilitarian, dull survival devices. They are exuberant, flamboyant, exciting, and beautiful. We use that word about them. And Darwin had this theory, which the other thing that made me want to write the book was just realizing just how unsuccessful Darwin was in pushing this theory in his lifetime. He was very successful with natural selection, but he completely failed to persuade any of his colleagues that sexual selection through choosy females, through mate choice, was why birds had beautiful plumage. That the females had a preference for beautiful plumage. You know, when you put it like that, it's kind of, well, why? You know, I mean, it's a sort of, you can see why his colleagues objected, and yet we now know that he was right, both in the mechanism and in the purpose of how it works. But it's still quite a controversial subject. There are, as you alluded to, there are twists and turns in the argument that haven't yet been settled. So I just thought it was a fascinating subject to go to, and a bit of light relief after viruses, perhaps.
So, by the way, I use a lot of sexual signaling I mean, in animal species in general, but in bird species in particular, in various of my own empirical work and in some of my writing. So, I'll give you an example. Uh, it, uh, One of the probably academic papers that has received the most attention, both within academia and within the media, was based originally on peacocking, whereby we took the principle of peacocking, we meaning myself and one of my former graduate students, and we wanted to demonstrate, of course, that in the human context, consumers engage in various forms of peacocking, sex-specific forms of peacocking, but we were focusing here on male displays, human males. And so what we did is we rented a Porsche, Matt, and I always tell people, I say, try to get a scientific granting agency to give you money to rent a Porsche for scientific purposes, which we did. So we rented a Porsche and we had a beaten up old car. We brought in young males and we didn't say imagine driving this car as you would in a psychology lab. We actually had them drive these two cars, either in a lek, which you could certainly talk a lot more about it. The lek in this case being downtown Montreal on the weekend where everybody can see me driving the car, or on a semi-deserted highway, a non-lek. We use those terms. And then the dependent measure, Matt, was the salivary assays that we took from the participants because we wanted to check their fluctuating levels of testosterone after these trials. Now, that entire theoretical framework was originally based, yes, generally on sexual signaling, but I even have slides where I show a peacock. And so that's one example. I'll give you one other example, and then I'll cede the floor back to you. and I think you mentioned this in the book, the bowerbird, I always argue, he's the Picasso of the animal, or certainly the avian world, right? He creates this bower for no other reason than to say, voila, look how artistic I am. Shouldn't you be choosing me? So, do you have other such examples? But I'm sure you probably covered those in your book, yes?
Yes. Well, the bowerbirds get a whole chapter in my book because it was a dream to go and see them. I managed to find somebody, a brilliant guy called James Butcher in Queensland, who could take me to see 5 different species of bowerbird within a week
Wow.
and to watch them doing their thing and doing their display.
This is
And
in
it
Papua New
really is.
Guinea?
What?
This is in Papua New Guinea?
No, this was in Queensland.
Oh, in Australia. Okay.
Did I say New Guinea? I meant Australia. Sorry. Yep, yep. Um, I also went to Papua New Guinea to see the birds of paradise, but I didn't get to see some of the bowerbirds in Papua New Guinea. But I would love to see them because some of them are even more spectacular. And for people who haven't got their heads around this, it really is very extraordinary that there are birds which create art installations with which to impress members of the other sex. There's no other way of describing it. Just to give you one example, James and I watched the bower of a great bower bird on the outskirts of a town in Queensland. We had to sit in a cemetery inside a little bird blind in order to watch this. And he'd built this sort of tunnel of twigs and grass stems, and then a platform of grass stems in the front, then green objects, then red objects, and then white objects in the front, beautifully laid out. The white objects graded by size so that the small ones were near and the big ones were far, far away. They were mostly man-made objects because we were in a town, so bits of broken glass and plastic and things like that. It included a toy hand grenade and a toy tiara.
Wow.
Um, and then we concealed ourselves and watched, and he trotted around and tidied up his bower, and then a female came along and went into the bower, and he got terribly excited and did his whole display, including showing the purple thing on the back of his head. And he then picked up a red chili pepper and showed her this and said, "Look at this." Now, experiments have shown that the more colored objects one of these birds can collect, the more chance it has of getting a mating. Why should the females mind about this? Why on earth should it matter how many colored objects he can collect? And that's the question to which I think there's a very counterintuitive answer, which actually doesn't quite fit with the sort of the peacocking in the Porsche that you're talking about, because what I think is going on is that the female is saying not, I want a male who is so good at collecting colored objects that his offspring will survive well. He'll pass on good genes for survival. I think what she's saying is, I want a male who is so good at collecting colored objects because he will pass on the genes to collect colored objects. That it's in that sense, it's a circular argument. Or as I put it, it's seduction of the hottest rather than survival of the fittest.
Beautiful. 2 points since you mentioned Queensland. You probably have seen the signs. We saw them in Sydney. This was my first sabbatical leave in 2001, and I spent 5 weeks in Australia, 2 weeks in New Zealand with my wife. We didn't have children yet, and there were warning signs saying if you're women wearing these hair brooches, be careful because a lot of these display birds will come to try to steal them from your head so that they could end up in the bowers. Have you seen those signs?
I didn't see those signs, but interestingly, in Australia, the uh, disposable plastic water bottles had blue tops, which they have in the UK, I think, as well. And they've changed that color because the satin bowerbirds like anything blue, and they were finding that these the litter problem in the countryside because the birds were stealing these blue tops.
Amazing. The second point I was going to say is, and I don't know if you get into this in the book, and my apologies, I haven't read it yet. I just kind of very quickly went through it. There are, I mean, you know this, so I'm not explaining this to you, but I'm explaining it for our viewers and listeners. There are sex role reversal species where, for most species, parental investment theory would say, well, for all species, the species that has to provide the greater minimal obligatory parental investment, that's the sexual dimorphism will go, they'll be bigger, they'll be less sexually restrained. And for most species, it is the males that provide the lesser investment. And so we see the sexual dimorphism in the way that we expected. Now, there are sex role reversal species where it actually is the males that provide the greater minimal parental obligatory investment, many of which are bird species. So that's another reason to love birds. And classic example from Australia, the Kaswari bird. So take it away,
Oh yeah.
Dr. Ridley. Yeah, did you know that?
No, I didn't know that was that the females are more brightly colored in
They're
cassowary.
they're much bigger, much
Wow.
more aggressive. They keep a harem of smaller males, and usually they're the ones who end up killing humans because
Right.
they've got these big claws. They're very territorial. So every single pattern of sexual dimorphism is reversed. And for those of you who don't know, please do a Google search on the Kaswari. It's straight out of Jurassic Park. I mean, it looks
Yes.
like a walking dinosaur from 100 million years ago. Do
It's a
you-
scary bird. There's no question about it. But I actually studied one of those role reverse birds myself as an undergraduate in the Arctic, a bird called the red phalarope. And it's a very striking case where it's a small bird. It's a bird that spends most of its life on the ocean, but it comes ashore in the Arctic to breed. And the females are a brick red with a black head and a white face and a black patterned back, and the males have a brown head, a patchy, much less bright pinkish breast, and a brown back. And it's the males that sit on the eggs, and the females that compete for them and that display to them. And I observed a behavior that I didn't understand, and I only understood it later when I was watching a television program about another role reverse bird called a jacana.
Yeah.
And that was that when the male left the nest, he would sometimes have to behave very aggressively to another female to prevent her coming to his nest. And this had been observed by someone before, and they said it's breaking the pair bond with his mate. And I realized no, it's not. It's a strange female. And why does she want to go to his nest? And why is he so aggressive towards her? And about half of the nests that we found in this study were destroyed. And we didn't really know what destroyed them. There was an Arctic fox one day, but it didn't come near the birds, etc. I now realize it was the females who were going around committing infanticide to try and bring the males back into a position where they could sit on another brood of eggs. So they were persecuting other males to try and get. And this is, of course, is exactly what gorillas do and lions do, except
I
it's the
was just going to
males
say
that kill the
lions.
baby.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So sexual selection theory is a wonderfully recondite subject, which gets you into all sorts of corners of the world. But above all, and I make this point in the book, it's the fun version of evolution. Natural selection is very utilitarian in the end. Either you die or you survive, whereas this is saying, let's see what we can invent. Why don't we put brightly colored eye-like shapes on the huge back feathers of a peacock? How about that? I mean, why? There's
Right.
no rhyme or reason to a lot of this, and therefore it's in a sense very creative.
What upsets me so much, and so now this is my 31st year as a professor. I can't believe that I'm that old. But trying to incorporate, as you know, going back to E.O. Wilson, who regrettably recently passed away,
Yeah.
trying to incorporate the exact same mechanisms that apply for every other species on Earth other than human beings. Suddenly, when you make the jump to human beings, you suddenly become a neo-Nazi, right?
Yeah.
In my case, apparently a Jewish neo-Nazi. So even today, 31 years into my career, I still get a lot of reticence from colleagues who say, come on, evolution doesn't apply to human beings. And if, of course, if it applies to human beings, it applies up to the neck, but
Yes.
then not here, right? So
Yes.
maybe opposable thumbs can be explained using evolutionary theory, but surely you can't be some kind of imbecile, Professor Saad, to think that the human mind, what makes us human is that we transcend our biology. It's, anyways, all the stuff you guys do in evolution, it's all unfalsifiable, just so storytelling. And that gets me so angry because you and I, in the last 5 minutes, discussed in parental investment theory and the pattern of sexual dimorphism across every possible species using one simple, elegant explanation. So the evidentiary threshold for evolution is astoundingly higher than other scientific fields, but yet we're accused of the exact opposite. You just sit with a cognac drink and a cigar and you just pontificate making up bullshit just so stories. I'm sure you face that. Are you as upset by that reflex as I am?
Yes, I completely agree with you. And in several of my books, I've explored the application of evolutionary principles to explaining human history, human behavior, and met severe resistance and accusations that one is somehow being, um, uh, uh, you know, um, morally wrong in doing this, which I just don't understand, because it seems to me culture can be just as despotic and tyrannical as genes can, possibly more so. Um, but I do say in my book, this is not a book about one boring African ape. Okay, this is a book about birds, and they're much more
Rockstar.
fun and they're more colourful and so on. But at the end, I do have a chapter where I say, okay, now that you appreciated the power of of sexual selection and realized with Darwin that it's a much more powerful force than we give it credit for. How did it affect human beings? And it's very obvious that there's all sorts of features of human behavior and anatomy that are designed to appeal to the opposite sex rather than designed to help you survive. But is one of them the human brain? Now, Geoffrey Miller wrote a book called The Mating Mind 25 years ago, which I think was a very good book and uh, hasn't really been built on. And in my pretty well last chapter, I give the idea a run for its money. And this is that the human brain expanded very rapidly between about 1 million and 2 million years ago. It accelerated in its expansion. And it's a very costly organ. So there must have been some huge benefit to having the biggest brain in the group, as it were. Was it purely survival? Did having a bigger brain than your rivals enable you to get through a drought better or find food better? Well, that's the default theory, maybe. But in that case, why didn't that happen to baboons or other animals on the African savannah? So maybe we could go to another theory that actually you need the big brain to understand society, to work out who's deceiving who and who's plotting what in your group. We live in large groups, so we need big brains to understand that. Well, yeah, but we kind of only lived in really large groups comparatively recently, once we had big brains already. So that theory, yeah, it might work, but it's not necessarily very convincing. And Geoffrey Miller says, well, hang on, look at what we use this big brain for. We don't just use it to help us survive and solve practical problems, and we don't just use it for social things. We also use it for wit and humor and music and song and language and showing off and all these things that have no conceivable practical survival purpose and not particularly convincing social one, but they blooming well have a strong sexual purpose. The whole point of singing is to seduce, judging by the lyrics of every pop song ever written,
Well,
bar a
many,
few.
by the way, many rock stars will say they first became rock stars to get the girls. It's not because they
Right.
had a general musical love. It's that they knew if I hold a guitar and I
Yeah.
start singing, the girls pay attention to me.
So is it possible that both sexes, in the case of human beings, because mutual sexual selection has been well proved, by the way, in birds as well, that both sexes were picking large-brained individuals to mate with because that was like the peacock's tail in our species, and that what you wanted was a mate who would give your offspring the ability to seduce other members of the species, and that was a big brain. I don't think. I mean, we're not a polygamous species like a peacock. We're not a lekking species, despite what you say about, downtown Montreal. So we wouldn't expect massive exaggeration of
Right.
the kind that you get in those species, but you do get sexual selection in very monogamous species like seabirds and others. There's no question about that. So I think it needs to be taken seriously as a hypothesis that the dramatic expansion of the brain in our species and not in others was driven by sexual rather than natural selection. That doesn't make it any more embarrassing as a theory or morally repugnant or anything like that. It's just a different explanation for what might have happened. The problem Jeffrey's got and I've got and you've got is how do we test that idea? And I
Right.
can't think of a good answer.
Okay, well, I'll get back to you once I've cracked that mystery. But here's another open hypothesis that I'd like to propose. Uh, or maybe it's already been studied. I don't think so, though. So I often say that, say, in the human context, mate choice is compensatory. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's suppose that all human females said, I will never mate with a guy who's less than 6 feet tall. Then
Right.
that would be a non-compensatory process, meaning that if I fall short, literally, of that standard, then I'm out of the mating game. But if mate choice is compensatory, I can compensate for that shortcoming. I could be very witty, I could be very good looking, I could be socially dominant, even though I'm shorter. So you then therefore women are choosing me based on a bundle of attributes, notwithstanding that all other things equal, if I'm taller, it would be better. So I wonder, do you think that other species, including bird species, would have evolved a compensatory strategy, or it's you've got to have the biggest tail. It's always the biggest tail that's going to win, and no amount of compensatory characteristics could make up that you're falling short on that trait.
Well, that's very interesting. And two things spring immediately to mind. One is that in birds with a lot of beauty in one sex, almost every part of the plumage is colourful. They don't just have one colourful bit on the whole. Every part of the body has to be beautiful, and they often sing as well. So clearly, in some sense, you've got to meet a criterion
Right.
in lots of different things. So your bundle is spot on, I think. But the bird that I particularly focus on in this book is called the black grouse, and it's a lekking bird, and you know what that means. It means that a dozen or 20 males gather together in a small space the size of a tennis court every morning, and it's the same space every day and every year to fight and display and sing and try to attract females. And the females visit these markets and stroll around unmolested, actually, and observe the displays. And then the females all choose the same male. Now, what's going on there is very non-compensatory in
Right.
the sense
Exactly.
that um, she's not the second female is not saying, well, yeah, but she's got him. I'd like this chap. He's nearly as good. She's saying, no, I want to mate with Fred.
Very
Um,
interesting.
but
Yeah.
she's mated with Fred. Everyone else is going to mate with Fred. Fred gets everything. I mean, literally, it's a winner take all system. And everyone else goes home empty handed. Not quite. There are a few individuals that also get matings. Now, most birds form pair bonds, monogamous pair bonds, to bring up their offspring, like we do, human beings. And when they do that, they must settle for second best, obviously, because the best guy's taken most of the time, or the best girl is taken. So you have to adjust your. I'm talking about birds here. I'm not trying to be too human. One bird has to decide, yeah, this is good enough. Now, of course, what you can do is choose a perfectly reasonable mate as a male as a mate who's not great. He's not particularly good looking. He's not particularly colorful. His song is only half good, but he's the best available. But once he's on the hook, let's have an affair with the tennis coach down the road. And
Exactly.
of course, birds do that all the time. I mean, this was the great discovery of the 1990s as a result of genetic fingerprinting, was that in these monogamous species, there's an awful lot of extra pair
What's
copulation.
the percentage? Is it like 10% extra
In
pairs?
some species, it's higher. I mean, I believe in one of the Australian fairy wrens, it was found to be 40%.
And it's
And
classified as a monogamous species.
yeah, and it is monogamous socially. There are two parents bringing up every brood, but he's bringing up a lot of other people's kids. Um, and
Amazing.
and I give the example of skylarks in my book, and there I think it was over 20%. I'll have to check, but it's a surprisingly high percentage. And when you think about human mating strategies, the things that really matter in a long-term relationship, things like kindness and fidelity and um, just general niceness, don't matter so much in a short-term relationship on the whole to people. That's a finding that's empirically replicated quite well. So the compensatory thing is a good way of looking at it, but the sort of settling for second best versus making sure you get the absolute best genes. And of course, one of the weird things about lekking birds is that because in every generation they're choosing the same male, they must have less genetic variety
Right.
than other species. And so there's no point in being so choosy. So the species that are most choosy have least reason to be choosy, arguably. This is known as the Lek paradox, and it's one of the subjects I tackle in the book.
Very interesting. Uh, so another one of those potentially open hypotheses that we can hopefully get some interesting person to collaborate with us on. It seems as though birds, in their processes of sexual selection, have been selected on a greater number of modalities than other, taxa. So meaning, you've got the red-capped mannequin who does a moonwalk a la Michael Jackson in order to attract the female. So in this case, it literally is his dancing ability. Then you've got other cases where it's my singing ability, hence songbirds. In other cases, it's my morphological traits, my actual plumage or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
so is it true to say that comparing to other groupings of animal, let's say mammalian species versus avian species, that they seem to have found a greater number of ways by which to channel the process of sexual selection? Or is that not true? You will find as much variety of types of sexual selection in mammalian species.
No, I think you're right, because think about it. If all birds cease to exist tomorrow, the dawn chorus would fall silent. The mammals contribute nothing to the early morning song in my garden. Reptiles even less. Um, and so, and birds, by the way, have way more visual perception than we do. They're greater visual acuity, but also more color channels. They have four color channels, whereas we have three usually. That includes ultraviolet. They actually see colors that we don't. So we don't know the half of what they see. And birds, but also some fishes and other invertebrates, have are the masterpieces of both color and song. Now, you could argue that, and if we were a mammal, we might argue this, that there is just as much excitement in a good smell in dogs as there is in a good color in birds. But I don't think that's the case. I think genuinely the masterpieces of sexual selection are the birds. And we are a slightly unusual mammal. Not only have we got good color vision, which most mammals don't, primates do, but other mammals don't. We have three color channels, most mammals have two. So we appreciate colors a bit like birds, but not as good as birds. But we also are fascinated by language and song in a way that birds also are. Whales are another example, perhaps, but in the mammals, but most other mammals, no good at that. So, in a sense, we are honorary birds.
But maybe not as smart as the New Caledonian crow. Have you seen the stuff?
Yes.
I mean, I genuinely believe that if I am pitted against one of those birds, I come out the moron in that exchange. Is that true?
Well, I'm sure you wouldn't. You're very clever, but I would.
Perhaps I know that you maybe you didn't cover those guys in the book, or I'm not sure if you did, but maybe you could talk a bit about it just from your experience with avian species of all the stuff that have been tested on them and how they understand, folk physics, right? They can drop something so that the water elevates, so they can. I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, you
Yes.
talk about bird brain. They're not bird. I mean, you usually use that term in a derogatory sense. They're
Yes.
actually Einsteins.
Yes, I think. Well, we better not get carried away. I think that their brains are genuinely a lot smaller because, well, mostly they are smaller too. But you're right. I think we've tended to underestimate the importance and evolution's masterpieces are the birds, not the mammals. I think that's true. Now, the other and sorry, just on language, if you want to teach an animal to speak words, parrots are way ahead of chimpanzees, for example.
That's true.
Um, uh, Dolphins are probably better, but it's not so easy to do. Um, uh, um, I've forgotten what I was going to say, but I was going to say something else along those lines about birds.
It'll,
Yeah.
it'll come back to you. What is the bird? I've seen him recently on my Instagram reel. There's a bird that is unbelievable in its ability to produce all sorts of man-made sounds, not just language. I
It's
mean,
probably the lyrebird in Australia.
oh,
It 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 can imitate a chainsaw. It can
exactly.
imitate a child crying. It can imitate, a telephone. It's extraordinary, and I've heard it actually in
So,
news.
so what is the mechanism? And maybe, I mean, this may be beyond our respective areas of expertise, but is it is it a mimicry module that's being instantiated in unique ways that it's because, right, you and I
Yes.
are not going to be able to do that because somehow our and by the way, mimicry, you kind of get that in the human context with with language acquisition, whereby if you don't learn a second language other than your mother tongue before a certain magical age of 11, 12,
Yep.
13, even though you might speak it perfectly, you'll never be able to speak it in a way that doesn't show that you have an accent. So it's as if your mimicry module fails once you enter puberty. But those birds retain it forever so that they can replicate the chainsaw.
Yeah.
So
Henry Kissinger had a German accent all his life. His younger brother Walter did not. He sounded like an American.
beautiful. Exactly.
But yeah, no. There's a bird called the sedge warbler which lives near where I live. It's a very small bird. It doesn't have a very big brain, but it sings a very, very rich song. That song is actually hundreds of different African birds that it has heard in the winter
Wow.
mimicked. So,
Amazing.
birds that would never come to Europe because they live in the swamps of Niger or something are being reproduced in Europe, as it were. Now, just back to the point I was going to make, and then I forgot it because it's about the humans' appreciation of bird beauty. Because Darwin was fascinated by this. He kept saying birds seem to have an appreciation of beauty a bit like us,
Yeah.
and it's quite when you show pictures of colourful birds to people, nobody says, "Oh, that's hideous" or "yuck."
Right.
They say, "Wow, that's lovely."
Yeah.
Now, why should it be lovely to us? I mean, most mammals don't look beautiful to us, but most birds do. We haven't shared a common ancestor since 400 million years ago. And that common ancestor was a sort of lumbering swamp reptile, which presumably didn't sing and didn't have colors and didn't have feathers or fur. So um, it's kind of puzzling that we should coincide in our decision of what beauty is. And my only answer to that is that what birds tend to do when they get sexually selected for beauty and what we tend to do when we're trying to be beautiful is produce pure tones of sound and pure hues of color. And when you think about it, those are improbable things to produce. It's much easier to produce a brown or a click than it is to produce a blue or a whistle, because you're you're restricting your output to one wavelength in each case. So I think that's my theory about why we both find the same things beautiful.
Very interesting. A personal point on birds. My first pet, which I received in Lebanon as a young child at the age of 5, which we then brought to Canada when we escaped the Lebanese Civil War. And my poor dad had to find a vet that would sign some form so that the Canadian authorities would let him in. She was a female. Now, we used to call her Iraqi in Arabic, we used to call her an Iraqi eagle, although she was the size of probably, a bit smaller than a pigeon, but looked very much like a raptor, like an eagle. And I would love to eventually, maybe you could help me actually find
Right.
what is this species name. And I loved her more than anyone in my human family. And when she passed away when I was 13, I was devastated. And thank God that's been one of the only times that I faced a death in my personal life. And so my first love was a female gorgeous bird by the name of Misho. So there you go. Can I
Well, I
go
had
ahead?
I had a bird called Hamish, which
Ah,
was
there you go.
a collared dove. My sister and I reared it, and it loved her and it hated me. It was interesting. It knew the difference between the sexes.
Amazing. Can we take a few minutes just to ask a few I mean they're not personal questions, but sort of about your career and so on before we wrap it up. So one of the things that, of course, I love about your work is you write for the masses, and therefore your work. I think in the bio that was sent to me, well over 1 million copies of all your books, 31 languages translated, and so on. Now, that would be uncommon to achieve had you been a professor, because then you would have been a very specialized guy. You'd be publishing now your 94th paper on some, and I'm not trying to denigrate it, but I appreciate peer review. I mean, I'm an academic, that's fine. But in your case, for whatever reason, maybe you'll share it with us. You decide, okay, I'm not going to go into academia. I'm still going to be a science communicator. I'm still going to be an author, and in your case, a very successful one. But I'm going to use a different modality to communicate my interest in science. Now, I'd like to think that I've been successful, one of the rare professors who, yes, I began my career doing all the peer reviewed and the testosterone assays and so on. But then later, once I can find a much bigger platform, including, having this show and going on other shows, then it becomes very difficult to go back to peer reviewed. Not because it's not as worthy, but life has limited time. You have constraints, and I could either write my next book, which will be read by 200,000 people, or write a beautiful scientific paper that will be read by 200 people, maybe. And so I've
Or
had to,
20.
or 20. I'm trying to be, I'm exaggerating the importance. Uh, so did you, as you were tracing your career early on, so that you went through the bifurcation, I'm not going into academia, were those some of the metrics that you thought of, or was it accidental that you became the sort of the author that you are today?
No, exactly this is what I have wrestled with at various stages in my career. And, I did a PhD, I enjoyed doing it, but I noticed at the end that I was enjoying writing it up, and my colleagues were hating writing it up. And but I wasn't enjoying remaining focused on one thing. I kept being distracted by other things. So I began to realize I was wide but not deep. I was enjoyed writing in a way that quite a lot of people didn't, and so I considered a career outside academia. And I remember a conversation with a tutor. He wasn't my supervisor, but he'd been my undergraduate tutor. And I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, be careful because there's no way back once you go out into the world and become a journalist. And I think you will find it frustrating that you're not in the front line. You're commenting on what other people have discovered rather than discovering things yourself." And I do know that frustration. There've been times when I thought, "Oh, I wish I'd kept at least part of my career in academia so that I could have made a genuine discovery in something and be taken a little more seriously sometimes in certain areas." But I have had a wonderful time because I've had a license to be curious, a license to call up professors all over the world and say, "You've written an interesting paper. Can I come and talk to you about it?" And that kind of thing. So as a science journalist initially, and then as an author of books, I have been able to explore a much wider range of topics than I would have done if I'd stayed in academia. And I think the kinds of ideas that I've wrestled with are just as profound as those of genuine academics are wrestling with. I don't myself pretend to be a world-leading thinker. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm someone who loves science, who loves knowledge, who loves ideas, and who loves writing about them. And the writing about them is part of the fun of exploring them. I only find out. Do you have this feeling that you only find out what you think about something when you've written it down?
I mean, so yeah, sometimes, absolutely. I mean, I'm particularly excited when oftentimes, and this is going to sound paradoxical, when I go in with an a priori hypothesis and then the results come out contrary to what I had proposed. And I go, God damn, I mean, we had developed such a gorgeous argumentation, such a beautiful framework to justify this hypothesis. And then we cast the die and oh, it didn't come out exact. That itself is exciting.
Thomas Henry Huxley said, "The beautiful theory slain by an ugly fact."
Exactly right. Exactly right. And
But I mean, God, I just so admire people like you or Richard Dawkins or people who have been frontline scientists, but have also taken the trouble to communicate with the rest of us, which quite a lot of scientists don't take the trouble to do. And I think it's really important that
oh,
that
thank
that,
you.
that
That's very
happens.
kind of you. Look, I've gotten, I mean, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of emails from people who say, you know what? I decided to go back to school and study evolutionary psychology because I saw you talking about it with such passion on show XYZ. I mean, that's influence too. So I think you were being a bit modest earlier when you said, well, I think I kind of contributed some valuable. No, I think you probably
Well, no,
contributed
but
more than most
like
academics.
you, I've had many people come up to me and say,
Exactly.
I read The Red Queen or I read Genome, and as a result, I decided to become a biologist or a
There you
medic or
go.
something." And it's a terrible responsibility. You've changed this person's career because,
All right, let me ask you one other question, but of course, I would love to keep you for hours with me. This is a question that I'm asking more often now, and it stems from the fact that in my latest book, my previous book, it was a book on happiness, and towards the end of the book, I talk about, living a life as much as possible without having any regrets, right? And so I there refer to, and in a sense, you already discussed one type of regret from your career where, oh, I regret that I didn't make my own unique contributions in science. So one of my former psychology professors in my PhD, his name is Thomas Gilovich. He, I mean, he didn't pioneer the idea, but he certainly pioneered the empirical investigation of the idea. He argued that there are two sources of regret. There is regret due to action and regret due to inaction. So regret due to action would be, I regret that I cheated on my wife and now my marriage is gone and I regret that. Regret due to inaction would be, I always wanted to be an ornithologist, but, my parents didn't think that that's a serious career. And so I became a physician. But now I sit here at 60 years old and I wish I could have pursued the path that I didn't take. Now, it probably doesn't surprise you, Matt, to know that over the long term, the regret that looms most in people's psyche is the one of the road not taken, the
Yes.
regret due to inaction. So if I
Yes.
were to turn that question to you and say, hopefully, you've got many, many more years to live. But if I asked you right now, go back in your life and if you can, share with us what might be the biggest regret. And let's test the theory as to whether it's due to inaction or action.
Well, I remember. I think my mother saying to me when I was young, "You regret the things you don't do more than the things you do do." And that really rang a bell. Actually, if I've done things that were a mistake, that have ended up either being no fun or backfiring on me and so on. And there are, so, uh, but you don't, on the whole, dwell on them and think, "I wish I'd never done that." You say, "Well, I learned from the experience, and at least I gave it a try," and that kind of thing. Whereas you know, turning down the chance to go somewhere or see someone, or it lodges in the back of your head, and you think, why didn't I just make the effort to do that? Um, uh, it, it's I don't have much regret. I mean,
Sure.
I think I tell you probably my most regretful decision was to do a PhD on bird behavior rather than on genomics, because I had done a lot of genomics as an undergraduate because my tutor was and he was going on and on about what an exciting time this was because the genome hadn't yet been sequenced, but we were beginning to discover all these extraordinary mechanisms inside the genome. Transfer RNA was quite new and things like that. So really almost in at the beginning of the most extraordinary episode. And why did I go off into a topic where there were no particularly brilliant new opportunities? It was just more of the same rather than and I think it was mainly because I wanted to be in the outdoors. I didn't want to be stuck in a lab and things like that, which is not a good reason. So I wish I'd become a molecular biologist, a geneticist for my PhD, and then goodness knows what might have happened. Now, to some extent, I put that right because when the Human Genome Project got going, I suddenly had this thought in my head: the human species is about to become the first species on planet Earth to read its own recipe in 4 billion years. I'm alive at this time. I want a ringside seat. I don't want to let someone else have all the fun of this. I want to be there. I want to be in the room where it happens. How do I do that? I know, I'll write a book.
Yeah.
And I wrote Genome, which was at the time, I think, still probably my best selling book. Um, and it enabled me to be there talking to people within the Human Genome Project, but also people who were beginning to think about what the implications of genomics would be. And it was so I put that right. But had I done that from a base of having a PhD in genetics rather than just evolutionary biology, I think maybe it would have been even better. But then I'd have missed out on all the fun of being able to write about birds.
I was just gonna say, as a means of assuaging that regret, you probably would not have written the current book had you been some boring molecular geneticist. So Thank you for making, in my view, the correct choice. Hey, Matt, can you remind us? I don't know if you've got, I don't have a physical copy of your book. I think they sent it to me at the university.
I'm gonna hold one up.
Yeah, bring one up so we can promote it. Let's do that. Yes.
Yeah, I should have had it in the background all along, shouldn't I? I'm not very good at these things.
Yes. This is
There it is.
the black grouse. There it is.
That's the black grouse, and it's a photograph that I took
Oh, that's
um,
gorgeous.
of a bird on a lek a few last year, I think it was, or the year before, and it's a close up of these extraordinary fleshy red things on their head,
Gorgeous.
and the blue color of the feathers are on the neck. And its neck is very swollen because it's producing this rucooing sound, a sort of bubbling sound that they make when they're singing.
Well,
So it's a beautiful and remarkable bird, and rather a rare one, and getting rarer. So
oh no.
all the more important to celebrate it.
Well, so I'm glad, just as we wrap up, number one, I'm glad to have had you back on for the third time. I'm glad that I corrected the wrong of not having brought you on for viral. That's been eating away at me. I've been regretting that. So we've hopefully ticked that off. Uh,
Well, my wonderful co-author, Alina Chan, was the real hero of that book. So you should have her on as
I
well.
would love to have her on as well. Please connect us. Thank you so much for coming back on. I look forward to your fourth appearance on the Saad Truth. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Matt. And best of luck with the book.
Thank you, Gad. It's been very kind of you to have me on the show.
Cheers.